massive, prolonged blackout. We're not talking about a quick storm knocking out your power overnight. We're talking days, weeks, maybe even longer. What actually happens to our world when that happens? Today, we're going to trace that collapse, starting right from your suddenly quiet living room all the way up to global survival. Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're breaking down the anatomy of a grid collapse. We're digging into expert threat assessments and academic models to figure out exactly what total grid failure looks like in the real world. Here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with when the grid dies, tackle the black start problem and cascading infrastructure failures before zooming out to the food supply threat, and finally wrap up with preparing for the dark. Part 1. When the grid dies, the immediate shock of losing power. You know, the reality of a blackout sharply contrasts with what we usually see in the movies. In a really fascinating Reddit discussion on societal collapse, user Badass Broccoli noted, "I can safely say that the abject boredom experienced by kids and adults alike ranked far above eating meals out of a can." It's true. The psychological shock of losing our constant digital dopamine loops is immediate. When your electronics go completely quiet, you're faced with absolute, crushing boredom way before any real panic actually sets in. But, well, that boredom doesn't last very long because visceral, physical threats follow right behind it. Think about it. Municipal waste treatment relies entirely on electricity. Without it, raw sewage can literally back up directly into your home. One first-hand account described an extreme, honestly terrifying fix. They had to deflate a 6-inch rubber ball, shove it into a basement pipe, pump it full of air, and then fill the whole thing with permanent concrete just to stop the neighborhood's waste from flooding in. It is a really stark realization of just how vulnerable we are. Moving to part 2, the black start problem. Why the lights stay off. Now, you might be wondering, why can't the power company just flip a giant breaker and fix it? Well, massive outages wipe out the grid's normal safety nets, and this triggers what the industry calls a black start. Basically, it's the painstaking process of bringing an entire electric power system back online without relying on any external energy from the grid itself. They essentially have to jumpstart this massive, complex system from absolute scratch. Okay, let's dive into this, because the process is wild. To execute a black start, operators must first start these small cranking generators. Once those are running smoothly, they carefully, and I mean very carefully, energize the transmission lines. That little bit of power is then used to bring larger plants online until finally they can gradually reconnect loads. They slowly add homes and hospitals back to the system piece by piece. It is a painstakingly exact sequence. And here's the real kicker on why this takes so long. Operators face this incredibly complex synchronization of frequency and voltage. If they make one single mistake, it can trigger another blackout, and they have to restart the entire sequence. Factor in damaged transmission lines, a massive dependency on fuel logistics and delivery routes, plus the fact that a lot of renewable energy systems can't actually operate independently yet, and suddenly, restoring power takes weeks instead of days. Part 3. Cascading infrastructure failures, the societal breakdown. So while we're waiting weeks for that black start to finally finish, what happens to society? Based on real-world observations and discussions on prolonged blackouts, a pretty grim timeline emerges. In the first 1 to 72 hours, it's mostly shock and that creeping, awful realization that help isn't coming. By day 4, grocery stores are completely emptied out. Panic buying just exhausts the limited local supply instantly. And by day 6, society really starts to morph. Normalcy shifts into a hard survival state, and communities often form mutual aid networks, basically banding together just because the normal systems have entirely collapsed. And we've got to remember, it's not just the power grid carrying electricity that we lose. A global internet shutdown, even for just one single day, would completely paralyze banking, healthcare, and daily operations. As noted by people who've actually experienced partial outages, losing our undersea cables and satellite links knocks out literally all modern administrative and financial systems. Even if the grocery stores were somehow full of food, you still couldn't buy a single thing with a credit card. Part 4. The food supply threat. Modeling starvation. An academic study by ALFED, that's the Alliance to Feed the Earth in Disasters, evaluated the resilience of our food supply chains during a catastrophic loss of electricity. And this brilliantly illustrates a stark difference in severity between two major threats: a cyber attack, which requires weeks or months of recovery, versus a high-altitude electromagnetic pulse, or HEMP event, which could demand a year-long recovery. The All-Fed study highlights that everything, our electric grid, fossil fuels, internet, transportation, and human workforce, is completely integrated. In a cyber attack scenario, we definitely see a substantial drop in food consumption, but researchers predict we could likely still provide adequate calories, assuming we have equitable distribution. But a hemp event? Totally different story. Breaking the critical infrastructures that feed the human workforce for an entire year would precipitate a state of widespread famine. Now, 2019 isn't just a random year here. All-Fed researchers didn't base this modeling solely on theory. They actually validated their system dynamics model using real-world data from the tragic 2019 Venezuelan blackouts. So this gives their predictions about our incredibly fragile, electricity-dependent agricultural supply chain a very validated and honestly a very real foundation. Finally, part 5, preparing for the dark, actionable takeaways. All right, knowing is only half the battle, right? Drawing on actionable intelligence from survival dispatch, your core strategies for self-sufficiency have to start with securing backup power and fuel. Think solar setups, batteries, or generators. You absolutely must store water and maintain off-grid sanitation options. Securing alternative communications, like radios or satellite links, is absolutely vital when normal networks fail. And most importantly, coordinate locally with your neighbors to share resources. You should expect a phased, rolling restoration of power, which means you need to prepare for days to weeks for sure, not just hours. Survival Dispatch really hit the nail on the head summarizing this. Treat a major blackout as a long-term disruption, not a short inconvenience. Because our interconnected systems, from banking to food distribution to the exact delicate sequence of jump-starting power plants, are incredibly interdependent. When the grid goes dark, the safety net is completely gone. Which leaves us with a final thought to chew on. If the grid went dark tomorrow, how many days could your household survive without a single external delivery? It's a challenging question, I know, but understanding the anatomy of a grid collapse is the very first step in finding your answer. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning and stay prepared out there.